Just after 10:05. Thanks for a lit open line. And now in the next hour, we are going to move on to a really fascinating conversation, one that I cannot wait to have. We're going to be asking the following question. Why did South Africa give up nuclear weapons? I know some of you just fell off your chairs. You didn't even know we had nuclear weapons in the first place, let alone gave them up. And we're actually the only country to voluntarily give up nuclear weapons in the world. And so this makes South Africa a unique country. But we often don't speak about this. And to join me to have this discussion, I'm really, really excited to be joined by an expert on this question, one of the foremost scholars working on nuclear questions in South Africa, Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk, who is Professor of International Politics at UNISA. Professor van Wyk, firstly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sizwe.
And before we kick off on the hard facts, what got you interested in South Africa's nuclear weapons program in the first place?
Yeah, I grew up close to the Valpits radioactive waste site in Namaqualand. And for always there's been some secrecy around what happens there. And over the years I met people that are also interested in the topic, and I met a few interesting people at conferences and started reading on it. And yeah, now some of the archives are opening up and more information is coming into the open. So yeah, so it's a fascinating topic and surely one that we still deal with today.
Completely.
And especially in the context of the government's plans to possibly develop more nuclear energy capacity.
Indeed, and looking forward to thinking about what this means for the present. But I'd like to take you back to the context, if you will. When did South Africa's nuclear weapons program start? And can you take us through the genesis of this secret program?
Thank you. Yes, obviously it started way back before, the main decade of the 1970s. During the Second World War, the United Kingdom asked South Africa to conduct a survey of the uranium deposit in our country. Remember that we were part of the Second World War effort, very close to the UK. But that's early stages. There was sort of an early atomic race going on. So they were it started to develop. And then in the 50s, the development of the Atomic Energy Agency. And then slowly, it was formalized, institutionalized. And then, of course, South Africa was still a founding member of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then also took part of negotiations for various treaties. And then by the 70s, a marked shift happens with B.J. Vorster becoming the Prime Minister and the nuclear weapons program really taking serious shape. And we must see this within a bigger context, obviously, of South Africa becoming more isolated, the domestic opposition growing, international voices becoming more curious about South Africa's intentions.
Right.
Apartheid has been formalized. So it became really an instrument now to fight the Cold War within Southern Africa, with the border war that we had in Southwest Africa, Namibia and Angola.
Right.
The presence of Cuban soldiers, Soviet Union soldiers. So that became sort of a checkbook and insurance policy for South Africa. And obviously it was conducted in secrecy, but there were a few incidences where South Africa was sort of caught out by the international community. I
think that's a very useful sketch of the way things worked. Take us through some of the incidents. Like you say, after the decision was made around the 70s, especially with the Vorster regime, which actually influenced the way the international community started looking and started to get worried about this potential nuclear weapons program.
Let me backtrack a little bit. In 1965, Verwoerd inaugurated South Africa's first atomic nuclear reactor, the Safari, South African Fundamental Atomic Research Installation, long word, established at Pelindaba.
Right.
So at that stage, it was very much a peaceful nuclear weapons program. And then, of course, in the 1970s, it became much more evident. So during that time, two or three very important developments took place.
Okay.
The one is that the ANC in exile, and here Abdul Minty, who became our ambassador at the Ayeye, is very instrumental. He organized the anti-apartheid movement in the UK and elsewhere across the world, and slowly, international intelligence services started to pick up some of the activities that are going on. So that's on the one hand that the domestic opposition that is in exile started to figure out what is happening.
Right.
And then came the two tests. The one is the so-called double flash incident, which we now know South Africa and Israel had a joint test in the South Atlantic, and then the discovery of the test site at Vastrap in the Kalahari.
And that was underground testing?
Yes, it was intended to be an underground test, but the facilities were discovered by satellite from the Soviet Union, who detected the typical kind of activities around a specific area, and then, of course, alerted the international community that then started to put pressure on South Africa.
It's amazing to think that at Pelindaba, just northwest of where we're sitting in the 702 studios, there was actually an entire secret nuclear weapons program.
Yeah.
Just briefly, take us through the scale of this program. Was it one nuclear weapon? Was it 1,000? What was the scale of this program that was being secretly developed at Pelindaba?
Yeah. Can I go back to the name Pelindaba?
Ah, yes.
It comes from Pelindaba, klaar gepraat in Afrikaans, or we finish the conversation. Now we know that atomic weapons are sort of a conversation stopper. I mean, it is sort of a final weapon, the ultimate weapon. And it was also a way, of course, for South Africa to say, look, we are not going to give in. We are going to develop the ultimate weapon. So for a long time, we didn't know exactly what happens on at Pelindaba and elsewhere. There were a large number of facilities, obviously, where some of these activities were placed. Some of the bombs were kept in mine shafts, for example, or in mines to protect them.
Wow.
What became evident when de Klerk made the official announcement in March 1993 in Parliament, that was the first time that the South African government admitted that we have nuclear weapons. And what is so interesting, he used the word devices. 6.5 devices. So
6.5.
The half is tricky, because was it something that was at that stage now being dismantled, or was it something that is going to be completed? So 6.5, which we built by busting sanctions, which we built to a large extent with our own capabilities. Of course, international assistance from Israel, even the Germans and the Americans assisted us. So these 6.5 devices, of course, they were sort of conventional bombs, but there were also missiles that could be fitted on a G5 or G6 cannon.
And what would that mean? Kind of reaching, would that be able to reach outside our shores? Would it be able to reach within the continent?
At the time, the discussion seemed to have been that it could be used in the border war.
Right.
But now, the difficulty is when you use a bomb, it's in your backyard, and the fallout will obviously affect you. So from the literature and also from the archives, it seems like the South African government never intended to use these bombs. But as we see now with Iran and even North Korea, you never know what a regime that is in a corner, or then an ambitious regime, what extremes can it go to?
Well, thanks so much for just taking us through the context and the background of this program. Really incredible and just fascinating stuff. I'd like to come now to the decision to give up this program, which in many ways makes South Africa unique. Can you take us through what the timelines were as South Africa started to decide that it wanted to actually give up the secret nuclear weapons program that it had built?
Right. So I just alluded to for example, what the ANC in exile and the anti-apartheid movement was doing by opening up this issue. In fact, the ANC became the first and I think the only liberation movement that was able to sit at the UN various committees to explain to the international community what was happening here.
Right.
Also, in 1978, South Africa lost its seat to Egypt at the International Atomic Energy Agency. We also experienced tremendous sanctions, which also put us in a corner. The border war was very costly. The domestic opposition also consolidated very strongly despite the harsh conditions. So it became very clear that South Africa needs to do something. Remember, in the mid-80s, there were also discussions taking place, initial discussions with Nelson Mandela and some of the other ANC leaders in exile. And now we also see this is the end of the Cold War, where something of a tide was now turning. And South Africa realized that if we want peaceful and meaningful change, there is a few things that we need to give up. Now, there is sort of the jury that is out, is whether South Africa gave it up voluntarily or whether the US or other actors, international actors, perhaps pushed us in the corner and say, look, you give up your weapons, we don't want it to be in a black majority government, or we will not invest in your country once everything has settled. So South Africa was sort of in a corner, and also the tide, as I said, was turning in terms of the illegality, the immorality of nuclear weapons, and the fact that when Namibia became independent in 1989, the release of President Mandela, and very importantly, the rise of F.W. de Klerk in 1989 after P.W. Botha's stroke. And de Klerk, that was one of the issues that he put on the table, was to start the dismantling project.
I think what's really fascinating about this timeline that you're sketching for us is that as South Africa was starting to make the transition from apartheid into the democratic order, so the secret negotiation about how these nuclear weapons would be disposed of was actually happening in many ways in parallel with that democratic transition.
Yes, but there's a snag here, is that South Africa, unlike other states that have dismantled their programs, South Africa started to do that in-house. De Klerk appointed a committee under Professor Mouton that started this process. So this was very much in secret. The discardment or the dismantlement of the program and the destruction of some of the documentation during what we now know to have been called Operation Masada. And it was by 1991 that the International Atomic Energy Agency, and with the changes that was taking in South Africa at the time, was that South Africa now returned to the IAEA, not formally yet, but now started to sign the NPTA, also now...
which is the big nuclear non-proliferation treaty.
That's correct, yeah. And also South Africa now signed the additional protocol and the safeguards agreement with the IAEA, which meant that now the books have to be opened and the facilities have to be inspected. So when the IAEA team came out the first time, they were unhappy that the books did not balance. And they asked the South African government to go back because there were some unaccounted for devices, uranium, etc. So it was only by 1993 that the IAEA said, look, we are now sufficiently happy that the program has been dismantled, the equipment, the bombs, the devices have been dismantled, and some of the facilities have been rendered not being able to use anymore.
Fascinating. We're speaking to Professor of International Politics at UNISA, Jo-Ansie van Wyk, about South Africa's decision to give up nuclear weapons. We gave up our nuclear weapons roughly between 1989 and 1993. We're looking into that program and thinking through what it meant then and what it means for South Africa in the world now. We'll be back soon after this break to delve into further questions about our nuclear weapons program. 22 minutes past 10, we're in a fascinating discussion with Professor of International Politics at UNISA, Jo-Ansie van Wyk, on why South Africa gave up nuclear weapons. Yes, we had 6.5, according to former President de Klerk, nuclear weapons, which we secretly dismantled. And we've gone through the historical background, how this program developed, and when it came to an end. And now I want to speak to Professor van Wyk about the reasons, because there are lots of different theories about why we gave up these weapons. So Professor van Wyk, let me come to you. There's a theory that, this was all about the National Party not wanting to hand over nuclear weapons to a democratic black government. Do you think there's any merit in that view?
I think it was a confluence of many factors. We spoke about the international pressure, the sanctions that was at that stage that was very costly for South Africa. The border war became simply too expensive. The domestic opposition was really putting a lot of pressure on South Africa. And it became sort of a position where there is only one way, and it is to start negotiations. And remember that we should not forget de Klerk as a personality.
Right. What role would you give to de Klerk?
De Klerk obviously was a contender to the throne for quite some time. And P.W. Botha, we now know, has had a very strong hand, hence his name as the crocodile, as we remember him. And when he had that stroke, and it's one of those unexpected gifts from history, that a leader's health can make such a change. And here comes de Klerk, and he realized this is a moment that he can seize for his own legacy. By then, the discussions with the ANC have started in exile. There was some relationship with Mandela through the interaction with Kobe Coetzee at that stage. So there were a lot of trust building going on at the moment, at that specific moment. So de Klerk appointed that committee that I referred to, and then now the trick was to convince the military. Because this program was very much under the military,
right.
Because it was a military program, and to convince the scientists. So there is a lot of history to be written about the position of scientists, whether they wanted to give that up. And de Klerk had to play that role very tricky. And then also something that is now also coming out in discussions and research is the role that the ANC played in the ANC, because we know today that there were pro-nuclear faction in the ANC as well as an anti-nuclear faction in the ANC. Even within the larger Africa continent, there were pro and anti individuals
Absolutely.
on the continent. Just to go back a little bit, we should remember that when the OAU, the Organization for Africa Unity, was established, two of the main tasks that it set, it's amongst many others, was one, to end apartheid as a form of colonialism on the continent, and second, to make the continent a nuclear weapons-free zone, an interest of yours. And we know that these two issues remain elusive for the next 3 decades until the 1990s. So the issue was now to convince the international community is how we return, so to speak. And 1990, we remember the euphoria with Mandela being released, the return of exiles. Some of these exiles, like Abdul Minty and others, were, of course, very much involved in the nuclear issue. They know what was happening, and these talks started to develop and obviously convinced the National Party government. But now, the jury is still out whether it was a voluntary decision or not. What is interesting...
Can I just ask you there on that? Yeah. Because you've said 40 fascinating things that I want to continue to probe, but how much do you think the ANC knew about this program, number one? And then how much do you think the ANC knew about the decision to give up the program? Were they instrumental in the decision to give it up, or did the National Party really present the ANC with a fait accompli to the extent that they said, listen, we had these, we've decided to give them up, now we need to talk?
Look, that was one of the bones of contention during the talks at CODESA and even afterwards, is that some of the negotiators and even some of the political individuals in the party said, look, but this has taken place, such a fundamental decision has been taken place without our involvement. Even for the international community, there was some questions, is how can you dismantle on your own? What happened to some of these things? The government said that we destroyed it, but what happened? And is there a way to verify that? So within the ANC, I think there were a lot more known by the ANC than we perhaps know today. Remember that at the time, the ANC relied and first of all had very good relations. At that stage, the ANC had many more embassies, if I can call it that, or interest offices across the globe than the National Party government had at embassies and high commissions.
Okay.
So the international network was to such an extent that obviously there was a lot of intelligence that was shared, governments that were pro-ANC, etc. And another element that the ANC had a number of spies within South Africa. One is Dieter Gerhard.
Now you're following President Zuma's lead.
Well, these have been Dieter Gerhard. He was a commander in the South African Navy at the time. He obviously was involved, and he shared some of the documentation with the
Wow.
Soviet Union. There were other individuals that were also jailed, Renfrew Christie, and also the individuals that were involved in the bombing of the Kuba nuclear power station that also used, or at least got hold of some of these plans, the nuclear plans.
Wasn't Mac Maharaj
Mac Maharaj,
somehow
yes,
involved in that?
yes, he was the handler, so to speak,
Wow.
of the individual Wilkinson that stole the documentation, and then eventually became part of a group that, sort of the ANC backed him. That then planted the bomb and obviously was taken out of the country. But Mac Maharaj was in Zimbabwe at that stage, and he facilitated the documentation to go to the Soviet Union for verification.
So fascinating. Another question raised by just some of what you've been explaining is about the scientists and the nuclear scientists. I mean, this required a tremendous degree of expertise. All that expertise was in the country at the time, and presumably many of those nuclear scientists are still with us. How does that work? And how does this network of scientists, influence South Africa today?
We must remember that South Africa's nuclear weapons program was part of a larger military-industrial complex and of the war effort of a country that was in a corner that wanted to get itself out. Some research still needs to be conducted on the position of the scientists. There has been books written by scientists and the military that were involved, but it's not the final story that's been written. I get the feeling that there were some non-disclosure agreements that had to be signed. Some of the scientists joined international organizations such as the Ayeye. Some of them perhaps retired. Some of them were just fired. But there's a lot of research that still need to be researched. It seems like some of those scientists, or at least all of them, were not necessarily involved in the nuclear black market. We only saw that later on, towards the 2000s, that one of these individuals then was obviously caught up in this and sent to jail.
Okay, going to stop you there. We have the headlines with Ayanda Nyati, and we'll be back with this fascinating discussion on South Africa's nuclear weapons program and how we gave it up after the headlines. It's just gone 10:30. It's 10:32, in fact. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, standing in for Eusebius McKaiser for the next 3 weeks. And we're having a really interesting conversation with Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk, who is an expert on South Africa's nuclear weapons program. If you didn't know, South Africa had nuclear weapons. Can you believe it? And we gave them up secretly between 1989 and 1993. And we're thinking through why we did that and what it meant then, what it means now. Also, we're really keen to take your calls. Give us some of your thoughts. Did you know we had nuclear weapons? Why do you think we gave them up? Do you think it was a good idea? Do you think it was a bad idea? Give us a call on 011-883-0702. Send us a WhatsApp, 072-702-1702. Or tweet me at Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Some of you have already been tweeting, and it's simple enough. The West were not comfortable having Africans owning or having the means to build nuclear weapons, says one of you. A number of your tweets coming through, a number of your calls I'm sure we'll be fielding soon. But we had a really interesting point of our conversation where we ended the discussion talking about the nuclear scientists. Let's go back into this question of what were the causes of this decision to give up nuclear weapons. And can you take us through the United States? Because the US played a great role conversing with the apartheid government and in some ways putting pressure on the apartheid government. What role do you think the United States played in our decision to give up nuclear weapons?
Obviously, the United States at that stage was very much involved in South Africa, and for a long time were one of our partners, despite the fact that there were international sanctions against South Africa. So a lot of things happened under the radar, so to speak. The role of the US was very much economic also. The trade that could, for example, take place should South Africa give it up. And there's sort of a conspiracy of silence. I don't want to be paranoid, but some of the archives are still not open to really see what happened. But for the US, it was seemingly also the fact that they did not want to have nuclear weapons in the hands of a black majority government. Remember that round about by the 80s, we are still in the throes of the Cold War. It's very much still an atomic era with the superpowers armed to their teeth. I mean, now we have about 40,000 nuclear weapons spread across the globe. There were much more. There was a détente taking place between the US at that stage. So the US obviously was very keen to have this also as part of that. And remember also that we got a lot of our highly enriched uranium from the US. The weapons-grade uranium. Some has been repatriated only now, fairly recently. And the jury is still out also, how much we still have in our own stockpile.
What happened with the highly enriched uranium? This is the stuff you need to build nuclear weapons. We built it. We had this highly enriched uranium. What did we do with it? Some of it, you say, was repatriated?
Yes. It was repatriated in terms of an agreement that South Africa had with the United States. But there's still a little bit confusion. Those that know don't speak, and those who speak don't know necessarily. So we don't know the extent of what South Africa still has. Some sources say 350 kilograms of highly enrichment, and that goes a long way. Around about by the 2000s, South Africa converted the Safari atomic research reactor that I spoke to earlier from using highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium, which was a unique process, and we should recognize our scientists that were able now to convert this installation to use lower enriched uranium, which has now obviously also contributed to our international status and prestige. So we don't know exactly where we are. South Africa is also not keen to be part of the International Nuclear Field Reserve, one under the IAEA and one under the Russians that was started under Vladimir Putin. And then another element is also now that uranium has been declared a strategic resource. And if you look at the government's nuclear policy around about 2008, and it hasn't been updated yet, states that South Africa intends to develop its nuclear capabilities and enrich uranium. Remember that also that uranium and very other isotopes, radioactive isotopes, can now be used for medical diagnosis, which also earns us a lot of money. So there seems to be a little bit of a resource nationalism that has developed subsequently. And all of this then obviously has this history of South Africa having uranium resources, having the capability to enrich it to weapons grade, now more recently to lower grade, obviously, and now whether we still have it or not. And that remains sort of an insurance policy if it exists. If not, I suppose we can sleep safer. But what remember also is that the IAEA often does unannounced inspection sites. There are more formal ones where the government is informed, but there are also ones that they just rock up at the gates of Pelindaba and then ask the place to be inspected. We can talk about the safety and security at Pelindaba.
We will get onto that, because I know there was a break-in at Pelindaba which caused a great deal of confusion and worry. But we actually have a call coming in, so I'd like to take this call and go to Ian, who I believe would like to make reference to a book. Ian, thanks so much for calling in.
You're welcome. Just a question about a book by Henny van Vuuren, about the Guns and Money, I think it's called.
Yes.
Where he refers quite a bit to nuclear weapons being developed in South Africa, but on behalf of the French. And they were transported out of South Africa by way of diplomatic bag to France. And at the end of the erstwhile regime, the French were actually the world's leader in nuclear weapons, according to this book, because of South Africa's assistance and development here at Pelindaba. Does your professor have any comment on that as to its validity, and can you expand on it perhaps?
Okay, thanks a lot, Ian. It's an interesting question. Reference to Henny van Vuren's book, Apartheid, Guns and Money, and the way that there was a relationship with France.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Henny van Vuren wrote this book exposing various other issues that happened, and some dodgy deals that took place. The French were very important that despite sanctions and international isolation of South Africa, they still remain very active in our program. Remember that the French built the Koeberg nuclear weapons or the nuclear power station. So what you do is when you go on to build an installation like that, you don't just get an installation, nuclear power station, you get a relationship of 40, 50 years because it's only the French technology that you can use, French expertise, French equipment that you can use. So the French had sort of their foot into the door. And remember also that France lost some of its face in North Africa. It used to test in the Sahara, which was obviously stopped towards the late 60s.
Yes.
The Germans also played a role with international interaction with the South African government and Germans. The Israelis, we had deals with them. Some say Taiwan, the United Kingdom. So South Africa is an example of a case where sanctions in this particular area do not necessarily achieve the results that it wanted to do, because it was also in the interest of these countries that they maintain their relationship. So two other issues that we need to remember also is the Helderberg case of the plane.
Okay, take us through that.
Some say that there were probably yellow cake or heavy water on the plane.
And those are crucial inputs into, or at least those are nuclear-related materials.
Yes. And of course, in terms of the international aviation authorities, it's not supposed to be transported in that. So we know that story has not been told sufficiently. The other issue is that South Africa had the Overberg test range in the Overberg close to Hermanus, where we tested a lot of missiles for these international customers, like the French, Germans, but also near St. Lucia in KwaZulu-Natal. We tested the Jericho missiles with the Israelis, and that was even after 1990. When the discussions were still taking place, some of the dismantling process has taken place. So, yes, there is a lot of paradoxes and skyneiligheid, by not getting the English word.
Skyneiligheid and spiti-piti.
Yes. And this is typical of nuclear politics, nuclear diplomacy, is that it is simply about national interests, and it was, for example, in the French interest. And some of the archives are now coming open, where it states that the French, for sure, were very much involved in our nuclear weapons program.
Speaking of the archives, you've made reference to archives which tell us something about our decision to give up nuclear weapons, but you also made mention that a lot of these archives remain closed, which is a bit of a worry because, we're approaching, 25 to 30 years since this decision was taken. What's your view on whether South Africa has been transparent enough with this decision and whether the archives are open enough? Let's start domestically.
There is a big loss that we incurred with that Operation Masada, the destruction of a lot of the documentation that were part of the process.
So people destroyed documents first and foremost.
Shredded,
right.
burnt, etc. The second one is, sadly, the ANC's archives on the nuclear position that it took is also spread across a number of universities in the US. Abdul Minty has a good private collection. The ANC archives, as we know, in Fort Hare is also not necessarily in a good condition. The South African government obviously has, with the old Department of Foreign Affairs, now more recently DIRCO, has now a very stringent process, where in the past you could really access the archive very easily.
Really?
Now, despite the PAIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, it still is very tricky to get access to that. And then, of course, the National Archive is also not in a good state. And two other issues is important. A year or so ago, Ronnie Kasrils spoke at a conference on opening the apartheid archives.
Okay.
And he made a plea is that all archives should be opened, not only those of the National Party government or the current government, but also everybody that knows or are involved in this and have papers on it, referring obviously to the ANC, should also come to the party and explain their role. Another thing that is important is that these issues of the nuclear weapons program were never brought to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Very interesting.
So some suggest that...
I never even thought that, it might, but of course, surely that's a crucial thing we need truth on.
Yeah. Look, Wilkinson, who was involved in the bombing of the Kuiberg power plant, he received amnesty. That's the only reference to it. There were also reference to the Dolphin unit that was sort of the ANC unit, intelligence unit that sort of backed him up. But the individuals involved were mentioned as involved in this process, but they were not sort of indicted or they received amnesty for that. So there is still a lot that needs to be discussed around that. And obviously also our chemical weapons program, Project Coast, etc., was also not part of that discussions and the revelations at the TRC.
I'm going to take you up on that and a few other questions. I also see a number of callers. We're going to go to a quick break and then we'll be back with Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk discussing why South Africa gave up nuclear weapons. It's about to hit 10 minutes to 11 and we're in conversation with Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk of UNISA about South Africa's nuclear weapons program and why it was shut down. Got a few calls coming in and I'm going to go to Sarashni now. Sarashni, thanks for holding for us. And what's your question?
Hi, Sizwe.
Hi.
Great to be speaking to you and your professor. I actually, the first question that I had, and I had a second question when I heard her refer to the chemical weapons as well. In terms of Pelindaba, I heard that the International Atomic Association came to South Africa. They did an inspection at some point, and they told the ANC government that it should be closed down because it was in very bad state and it was leaking. But that this was kept under wraps. The other thing is that I heard, because she spoke about the chemical weapons, I've heard that Walter Besson's laboratories and that type of thing have just been kept as they were. The people working there and the people working in his labs, that it still continues up to this day. These are things I've heard. I can't back them up. I want her to tell us.
But Sarashni, you sound like former President Zuma at the State Capture Commission. You have information, but you can't tell us where it came from. No, we won't ask you. We won't ask you for your spy network.
I'm sounding like that. I agree.
Thanks a lot. No, fascinating questions, Sarashni.
Yeah. Very good questions, and one. Are a few questions that we need to discuss. One issue that the South African public does not talk about, and that is the health issues surrounding Pelindaba. And that is also an sort of a silent issue that the health concerns of some of the individuals that worked within Pelindaba, but also the communities around it.
Wow.
And it's typical that these facilities are put where they are isolated, marginalized communities. For example, in Kuiberg, it was built around close to Atlantis, which was also one of apartheid's cities that were built. In Valpits, our nuclear waste site, also within a colored community there in Pelindaba, around the dam and some of the communities there. So typically these installations are very isolated and then these marginalized communities. The National Nuclear Regulator has at one stage said to Pelindaba, we are not going to renew your license. Remember that all of the nuclear facilities has to be regulated by this organization. Both Pelindaba and the nuclear waste site at Valpits were not receiving very good feedback from the nuclear regulator. So there are questions about the safety and the security of these installations. And the IAEA has, in its reports, stated that our security needs to be beefed up, and also the fact that the break-ins that have taken place.
Tell us about that break-in, because I think this is quite an interesting question. The South African government obviously said that, it was just an incident of crime, but you really don't want break-ins to be happening at really important nuclear facilities.
In my view, there are still too many radioactive material floating around. Hospitals, for example, that use radioactive material for medical purposes, what happens to that waste? A few years ago, some material was found in somebody's backyard. We had the case of Visser that was involved in the AFCONE ring of Pakistan, for example. We had the break-ins in Kuburg. There had been some shutdowns and some exercises taking place. So there is a lot of concerns still remaining. And whether it is crime or whether it is for other issues to get intelligence, for example, it remains a problem. Every break-in at a nuclear installation is a problem.
Yeah.
And then the fact that the government is very silent on it. For example, what happens if there is a nuclear incident at Pelindaba? Johannesburg will be affected. Pretoria.
I mean, absolutely, both cities.
Yeah. So in my mind, I don't even know what to do in an instance like that. There is a community involvement around Pelindaba, but for the rest of us, I don't want to be alarmist, but our national warning system is not very good. And so what do we do? And I think there need to be greater awareness, not only of the safety, but also what happens. And surely there are health concerns that seem to be not put into the open.
Absolutely. We've got another call coming in. We've got, I think Salma just jumped the gun. Sorry, Salma. We know you were waiting for a long time there, but everything you're saying just has to be said. I'm hanging on every word here. And I'd like to also bring this into the present, because, South Africa's had a big debate recently about the reintroduction of the role of at least nuclear energy into our country. Do you think this has anything to do with the nuclear weapons or the military itself?
South Africa has signed very important international treaties, as well as the IAEA Safeguards Agreement and the additional protocol, which means that there is no way that we can go back. If we do, it will be a devastating blow. We've also recently signed the treaty that bans nuclear weapons. So we have made a number of international commitments repeatedly that we do not support the nuclear weapons programs, and that it is basically those three pillars, that we support nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and then coming to the electricity generation for the peaceful uses, be it then for medical reasons or then for the generation of power. So we have gone through this nuclear energy power generation debate for many years. It comes up, it goes away. Government realizes it's too costly or the time is not right. We still have big coal interest in South Africa. AFCONE is very strong. So it is an issue that comes up that is costly, and that is the thing, is that it is so costly. And of course, the fact that that people sometimes are against it, sometimes pro-nuclear, and government cannot make a decision on it because of the insecurities, financial insecurities that go along with it. So even the last round during President Zuma, we had the vendors program, and some say that the Russians were very much in front of who will now be appointed. Some say Chinese also, and that debate has quietened down. But it seems like the Ramaphosa government has said that they will investigate, and some developments hopefully will come out so that we have finally clarity. The thing is also that Koeberg is reaching a good old age now. It became critical in the 80s, 82, 83, and it's an old installation. It has been given facelifts, nuclear Botox, whatever, and it is an old installation. And we in terms of our energy needs, we surely need either solar or wind energy. Coal is expensive in the sense that it has a huge environmental impact and will affect our commitments that we made internationally. So what remains? We have very good uranium resources. The government has declared in the 2008 policy document that we are going to go this route. And as I said earlier, that document, that policy has not been amended. So it's still in the books, but we wait for the political masters to make that decision.
And just finally, as we close out this conversation, what do you think the overall impact of the nuclear weapons program and the decision to renounce it means for us in the present in South Africa today?
It has given South Africa a lot of status and prestige at international fora. We have become the point of reference for how to dismantle. Even in the case of North Korea and Iran, the dismantlement of that is to say, but look, follow the South African process and see what we can learn from that. It is an issue that is not much discussed. I think there is a little bit of political amnesia, perhaps sometimes also a little bit of political nostalgia. We were so strong, we could do it on our own. So there's also a narrative that has been built around that. And the fact that government goes onto international fora and say, we are the country that have voluntarily dismantled it. And then it's so interesting, that even within the ANC, as I said earlier, there were divisions on which way we go. But that issue has been taken into post-apartheid South Africa as an issue that is still something that gives us, despite all the negative things that may be said against us, is something that we still receive a lot of international credit for. And then, of course, our involvement in the medical isotope business. We make a lot of money from that. And export a lot. We are the largest producer in Africa. We export all over the world. So that is an area where we can still make a good contribution in terms of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy.
Well, what a fascinating discussion we've had here with Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk, who is Professor of International Politics at UNISA. We've been discussing South Africa's decision to give up nuclear weapons. Professor van Wyk, I just want to thank you so much for taking a full hour of your busy schedule to speak to us about this question of nuclear weapons.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching the content. Like, share and subscribe on all platforms, smwx.co.za to join the WhatsApp channel. And let's build a new conversation for a new generation. I hear you.